Hey, James, thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
So, from childhood to adulthood, who was Bruce Lockhart?
Robert Bruce Lockhart was a man of intense contradictions. So he's both a self-indulgent party boy who's always womanizing, always drinking, always getting into trouble. But on the other hand, he's also highly intellectual, very thoughtful, very creative, and very good at the various jobs he does throughout his life, being it a writer or a journalist, propagandist, or an intelligence gatherer. And this dichotomy of his character is there from the very start, his early career. Like a lot of men of his background, he's sent off to the colonies to make a fortune when he comes of age. He's 19, sent by his family to Malaysia. They put him in charge of a rubber plantation and they say, go make us a lot of money. Instead, he spends his time drinking gin and tonics, shooting rats, which infest his bungalow. He seduces a Malaysian princess.
As one does.
As one does. And in the process creates a massive scandal with the local sultan. Pledges to convert to Islam to try to nullify the scandal. Never does it, but pledges it regardless. Contracts malaria, nearly dies. It's a complete fiasco. Doesn't make any money either the whole time he's there, incidentally, despite being in a rubber boom. So you've got that one side of his character, but then when he gets back to Britain, he becomes part of the Foreign Office. He gets sent to Moscow, and it's there that he becomes this intelligence figure.
So, when he's about 30, he goes to work for the Brits. How did he end up becoming a spy?
So he starts life in Moscow as a vice consul. His job is meant to be stamping passports. But instead, because he's bored, basically, he starts gathering intelligence from the various revolutionary groups that are in Russia in this final days of the Tsarist Empire. And so he compiles these intelligence reports, sends them back to the Foreign Office, and they're quite insightful. He's talking about how there are these different groups that have different politics. He predicts that there's going to be some kind of revolutionary moment happening in Russia soon. And that means that by the time he's barely 30 years old, when that revolution happens, the Bolshevik Revolution in the fall of 1917, he is seen by some very key figures in Whitehall, not the least of which being the Prime Minister Lloyd George, as the man on the spot who can get us the intelligence on these people, the Bolsheviks, and understand what's going to happen next.
You'd also called it amateur hour because we're about 9 years into MI5 and MI6, 1909. Meanwhile, Russian intelligence through the Okhrana had been around for a few decades before. So did Lockhart have support? Did he have resources? What were his orders when he officially ended up working as a British spy?
So his official title was British agent. So that's both a spy and a diplomat. In that capacity, he's working with MI6 in Russia, which is pretty threadbare at this time. As you say, MI6 has only been around since 1909. Its capacity is quite limited in terms of manpower and resource. And so they're having to rely on this tradition that goes back to the Victorian era in British intelligence gathering, where it's people who are adventurous, it's people who are perhaps have some local knowledge in far-flung parts of the world, and they're basically relying on these people to model their way through and figure out what they're going to do. And that's basically where Lockhart sits in this. He is the man on the spot. His orders are very vague, and he just has to figure it out.
It sounds like a kind of exciting moment to be a British agent, as it were. But was he a good spy, or was he too busy enjoying the excesses of Tsarist Russia?
Certainly enjoyed the excesses. He was good at gathering intelligence. He had the right personality for it. Inquisitive mind, capacity to charm, knew how to ask the right questions, and how to put together the answers into pretty good intelligence reports. Anyone who's read intelligence reports knows they can be rather dry. His are not. They're actually good read. When it came to operational aspects of tradecraft, no, that wasn't really his thing. And again, it's a lack of training, and it's the fact that he is basically working unsupervised. He is, as I say, making these things up on the spot. That means that he is making up his own plans. He is his own boss.
So we're talking about a moment where things are about to change drastically in Russia. What is he seeing on the ground before we get to the assassination plot?
When he is serving as British agent, it is at a time when the Bolsheviks under Vladimir Lenin are trying to consolidate their revolution. Russia is a mess at this point. The reason the revolution happens is because economically and societally it implodes under the pressures of war. So food is scarce. There's no one sweeping the snow off the streets. There's inherent lawlessness in Moscow and St. Petersburg. So he's seeing that this revolution is actually a bit of a disaster. And he's also seeing a lot of violence. And he sees firsthand when he's taken on a tour of anarchist safe houses across Moscow by a member of the Cheka. And he sees the aftermath of one of these massacres where they go into an anarchist house and they shoot the place up. They leave the bodies there as a warning, basically. And this is a warning that's being sent to Lockhart as well, incidentally, by the Bolsheviks. They're saying, this is what we do to enemies.
And is he fearing for his life, or what's his mental state as he's seeing such brutal scenes?
I think he's enjoying himself too much to be scared. He loves the danger. He loves the fact that he is at the center of these great events. There are moments where he understands that he's in danger. In the spring of 1918, he realizes that his communications are most likely being tapped by the Cheka, but that doesn't stop him from sending pretty incriminating messages back home about the things he's seeing. So he chases the danger.
So how does the plot to kill Lenin get started?
Well, Lockhart's original mission was to try to keep Russia in the First World War. Because remember, the First World War is still being fought at this time. Russia is meant to be Britain's ally. The Bolsheviks extract themselves from the war in March 1918. So he has to figure out a way to get a new regime in power that's going to bring Russia back into the war. Initially, he tries to play nice with the Bolsheviks, particularly befriends Leon Trotsky. But by the summer, he figures that diplomacy isn't going anywhere. And he's under the influence of a number of other Allied agents in Russia who think that drastic measures need to be taken. And one of the more influential of them is the so-called ace of spies, MI6 officer Sidney Riley. And it's Riley who comes to Lockhart saying he's got contacts who within the Red Army who are willing to turn against Lenin.
How did Sidney Riley capture Lockhart's attention and really lure him into this idea?
Riley explodes onto the scene in Moscow when he arrives in the spring of 1918. He walks right up to the Kremlin and he demands to see Lenin. And the guards at the Kremlin are like, who the hell is this guy? And they call up Lockhart and they say, there's this man called Riley here. What? He's British, we know that. Is he one of yours? And Lockhart said, I have no idea who this man is. And that's his introduction to Sidney Riley. I think Riley, like Lockhart, these are brother rogues. These are these adventurous types who just gel together. Lockhart, I don't think, ever fully trusts Sidney Riley. Who would? But at the same time, I do think that the cavalier streak in Riley was something that appealed to him. It seemed like Riley was the kind of brazen man, extreme man for extreme times. That appealed to Lockhart a lot.
What about the plan made Lockhart say, let's go forward? This is a good idea.
He felt that his mission in Russia was going to be a failure. He'd already been seen as a bit of a dark horse in this role. And by the time we get to the summer of 1918, he is really fearing that he's going to be sent back to Britain. The Bolsheviks are going to establish their rule, and he's going to be seen as the guy who screwed it all up. So partly he wants to make sure that doesn't happen. There's a part of him, I think, that also likes the idea of etching his name in the history books, the man who stops the Bolshevik Revolution. He's also formed some pretty deep bonds in Russia, particularly with a woman by the name of Mura Budberg, who herself is a spy. He wants to still be with her. He wants to be in the Russia as it was before the revolutionaries came with her. So there's a lot of motivation there.
So Lockhart and Riley have been hatching this plan to kill Lenin. Does MI6 have any idea what's going on?
Most likely not. The MI6 station chief, Ernest Boyce, he's basically in charge of Riley, as much as anyone could be in charge of Sidney Riley. He understands that there is a plot happening, but he doesn't know the details. And this is an important point that a lot of historians have missed, is that actually there's no approval of this from Whitehall. No one or from Paris or from Washington, D.C., because there are American and French diplomats and spies involved in this as well. This is not an officially approved act. This is people on the ground making it up as they go along.
How did everybody get involved?
Well, they're all members of the Allied nations whose interest is to get Russia back in the war. The diplomats all talk to each other. They all get together. The American embassy is actually the main base where a lot of the plotting happens. And it's there with spies, diplomats from Britain, France, and America that they come up with this idea that they're going to try a coup d'etat.
How do they expect they will kill Lenin?
Well, the expectation is that he's going to be captured, and as in Riley's account of things, what's going to happen is Lenin and Trotsky are going to be captured. They're going to have their trousers pulled down, and they're going to be paraded through the streets to humiliate them.
Okay, I didn't know I was going to have to ask quite this question, but walk me through how getting your pants pulled down takes you to then losing your life.
Well, I think the idea of ritual humiliation, let's call it that, of Lenin and Trotsky is something that an eccentric like Riley would look at and say, well, that's going to get the job done. But the actual plan itself called for subverting a battalion of the Red Army and getting them to turn their guns against the Bolsheviks. It called for the dynamiting of bridges outside St. Petersburg. This was going to be violent. This was going to be brutal. This wasn't going to be fun and games. And that's where, if you think about it logically, it's never said out loud, but it's quite clear in the planning that, yes, we're going to arrest Lenin and Trotsky. But armed counter-revolutionaries are going to arrest them. And the various revolutionary factions that the British and the Americans and the French are bringing on board, counter-revolutionary factions, they all want Lenin and Trotsky dead. So it's not so much that Lockhart and Riley are lining up to pull the trigger themselves. They just are creating a situation where someone is going to kill Lenin and Trotsky.
Okay, so they're basically fomenting the killing.
That's it.
Now, what could possibly go wrong with a plan like this?
What could go wrong with it is a man by the name of Felix Dzerzhinsky, who is the head of the Cheka, the Bolshevik Secret Service. Dzerzhinsky, unlike Lockhart, unlike Riley, he's not playing games. He is a career revolutionary. He is a very astute spy. He has informers everywhere. And he also has people within this section of the Red Army that the Allies are trying to subvert who are working for him. And it's precisely those people that Riley contacts. So from the very start, when Riley is in contact with these men from the Latvian Rifle Brigade, is what this unit of the Red Army is called.
Sounds like a band from the 1980s.
It does a bit, doesn't it?
Just need to put that out there. Go on.
They're actually the elite of the elite within the Red Army, the Latvian Rifle Brigade, which should have been the first sign that you probably can't trust them to launch a coup d'etat. But regardless, Riley does. And the men he contacts from the Latvians, they report directly to Dzerzhinsky. He knows what's happening basically from the start.
Does he surveil after that? Does he give it a little time to see more of what happens? Does he immediately stop the plot?
No, he wants to see it play out. He wants to see how many members of the Allies he can net. He knows that there is a wider conspiracy afoot, and so he allows these meetings to take place between the Americans and the French and the British. He also, it's not just Dzerzhinsky. Again, to circle back to Riley and his incompetence here, Riley is leaving notes around his safe houses with the names of his informers on them. And so when he's meeting these Latvians, they're they're looking at these notes and they're getting extra names to the network. They know who his informers are, where his safe houses are. And so there's this, it's both Jarzynski being very competent and its incompetence on the side of Riley and Lockhart as well, because Lockhart never vets any of these Latvians, never does proper background check on them. These are meant to be confidential informants. They never look into their background and see what do they actually believe vis-a-vis the revolution.
So when Jarzynski decides to put a stop to the plan, how does that play out?
Well, the catalyst is there's an attempt on Lenin's life at the end of August 1918. Nearly kills him. In fact, he's shot 3 times. The person who nearly kills him is a socialist revolutionary. It's not tied to Lockhart and Riley at all. But Jarzynski believes that this person is, and so he sees this as, well, this is the start of the coup. This is they're gonna drop the hammer, so I need to get there first. And so the next morning, he authorizes a series of raids across Moscow and St. Petersburg, raids on Riley's safe houses, raids on the MI6 station chief Ernest Boyce, his residence, a raid on the British embassy, which actually ends in a gunfight where the military attaché there is killed, and a raid on Lockhart's apartment, where he and his lover, Mura Budberg, are taken prisoner.
And did he admit to being involved in an attempt to overthrow and ultimately have Lenin killed?
No. He maintained from the time he was in the Kremlin right through until pretty much the day he died that this was a Riley thing predominantly, nothing to do with him. He had a vague idea that there was something going on, but beyond that, he had no deep knowledge.
How did he get out of it?
Well, because it had become such an international incident, the British retaliated by imprisoning Bolshevik ambassadors in London. And eventually, towards the end of 1918, they negotiated a prisoner exchange, Lockhart for the Russians. And not just Lockhart, but a good number of allied diplomats, people who were captured in the Chequers dragnet, their families. But it's not as easy as that for Lockhart. Him and Riley and some other key conspirators are all tried in absentia, and they are found guilty of high crimes against the revolution and are told that if they ever set foot on Russian soil again, they will be killed.
So was Riley caught? What happened to him?
Well, he being Riley, he snakes his way out of it. He avoids the dragnet. He dons disguises. He moves from one safe house to another. He has a number of lady friends who put him up in various parts of St. Petersburg, and eventually he smuggles himself out of Russia. He actually gets back to Britain before Lockhart does.
Lockhart, not so lucky.
Not so lucky, no.
So the Bolsheviks realize that it's not just the British who are involved in this plot. Is this when the narrative forms that the West is attacking Russia, that they are ultimately trying to plan its demise?
I think so, yes. When you look at the way that they're talking about it in the Russian press, the Bolshevik press, the propagandizing of it, the fact that they're saying that this isn't just a bunch of rogues on the ground doing it, but this is the state-backed conspiracy involving people in Paris, people in Washington, people in London. They're getting together to destroy our revolution. That is the narrative that gets set there and persists for many years after the fact.
But where did they get the idea that the leadership in these other countries had signed off on it?
Well, it was a fair conclusion to draw given the scale of the conspiracy, and also given the fact that from the Bolshevik point of view, I mean, that there are not rogues running around in Russia doing their own thing. You know, everything is being controlled from the top. So they're looking at this through an authoritarian lens and saying, well, you know, we know what our spies are doing. Everything that we do is you know, formed in some way for the benefit of Lenin or through Lenin's mind. That perception allows them to look and say, well, obviously, the prime minister, the president, they know about this stuff.
So there are 2 misunderstandings. The first was that the shooting of Lenin was tied to this particular Western plot, and then also that Western spy agencies in their respective countries had condoned this plot.
Yes. There's also another myth that perhaps comes out of this from the Russian point of view, is that they really big up British intelligence capabilities, and they talk about Lockhart as some kind of master spy in this time, because it suits the narrative to say that, our enemies are so much more advanced than us. They're so much more crafty, so much more devious than us, so much better resourced than us.
Even though the Brits have been doing this for literally 9 years.
Yes. But again, this is Britain. This is the world's largest, most powerful empire. There's a narrative to tap into from the Russian point of view of saying, well, this is the world's preeminent military power. Why wouldn't their intelligence services also be phenomenal?
And so how does this incident affect MI6's relationship with Russia?
I would say that there's a lesson learned by MI6 from this, which is that the Bolsheviks are not messing around. Keep in mind that from the British point of view, when the revolution happens, there are a good number of very high-ranking people in London who think that this is all a German plot. They think that Lenin and Trotsky are just German agents. Now, there's some truth to that. Lenin was sent back to Russia by the Germans on a sealed train so that he could cause trouble. That's true. But this idea that the revolution is somehow insincere and that these men are just German agents was completely wrong. When the Lockhart plot is unraveled, when the efficiency of the Cheka is revealed, that's when I think not just MI6 but Western intelligence services in general realize actually these guys are for real.
And there's also the rogue agent lesson, I would think.
You would think, but in truth, professionalization in the British intelligence services does take some time. It really does. You still have very cavalier figures turning up in the Second World War, muddling through, making things up on the ground, which personally I think is an important part of espionage to an extent. You've got to have creativity, you've got to have dexterity, you've got to have people who can think on their feet. That's as vital today as it was back then. But there were extremes to that. So I wouldn't say it leads to a new era of professionalism, but it does lead to some wariness over British capabilities as opposed to Russians.
So how does the narrative evolve over time? Because there was the story that the Bolsheviks told to the Russian people. And then we move into a new era under Stalin. What was Stalin's interpretation of these events?
Well, Stalin, as with most things, sees it through the lens of his own personal gripes and grievances. He detested Leon Trotsky, absolutely detested him. Trotsky was probably the friendliest of the Bolsheviks towards Lockhart, closest to him for a time before the plot happens. So when Stalin comes to power and Trotsky is exiled from Russia, the narrative switches and it becomes, well, it was Comrade Trotsky who was conspiring with Lockhart against Lenin. Trotsky was involved in the plot. He gets woven into the plot, even though he was a target of the original plot. In the Stalin point of view, Trotsky is an allied agent of the corrupt West. So that's the first change that really happens.
Okay, so now we know that Stalin has taken the narrative and included his enemy Trotsky as part of the plot to kill Lenin. How does it continue developing? What happens after World War II that might be important for us to talk about?
Because of the work Lockhart does during the Second World War, running Britain's psychological warfare against Nazi Germany, that enhances his reputation in a negative way to the Soviets. They're able to look at him and say, well, he wasn't just the man who tried to kill Lenin, he wasn't just working with Trotsky, but he's also this devious, psychological warrior. He's an arch propagandist, this deceiver on a mass scale. And what happens after the Second World War is when the Cold War proper starts, Lockhart is really singled out in the Soviet press as this man who wasn't just a master spy, but a deceiver of the highest order. And they use his work during the Second World War to kind of dig up the bones of the past, basically, and say, look at the kind of people that we're up against. And it reinforces that narrative about the West being in constant competition with the Soviet Union. And it's a way that the Soviets enabled the plot to keep living in the memory. They tie the events of 1918 to the events of the Cold War as it's developing after the Second World War.
So we're moving away from an assassination plot and more into psychological warfare.
Yeah, we're moving into the idea that there are these people like Lockhart, these nefarious, highly trained, highly capable propagandists and deceivers and practitioners of espionage that the West has been deploying since the very beginning, since 1918, against us. Lockhart represents that continuity in Soviet eyes in this relentless campaign, as they see it, by the West to destroy Russia.
Kind of ironic when you think about the 2016 election and how the U.S. intel community says Russia interfered partially through disinformation, hacks, leaks, influence operations, that they accuse us of things that they themselves are doing. But so from there, where does the narrative go?
I think that the legend of the Lockhart plot, and it is basically a legend by the time we get to the middle of the Cold War era, sort of 50s, 60s, getting up to the time when Lockhart's nearing the point where he dies in 1970. By then, it's become this almost foundation stone on which antagonism between East and West is built. Well, one of many foundation stones, and the one that from the Russian perspective they can look back to and say that there had been this intense need to destroy Russia from the very start. The moment we start exerting ourselves on the world stage, taking control over a corrupt czar, that's when the West intervenes. And that narrative, as we see, persists to this day.
Yeah, let's talk about some of the things that Putin has said that reflect this narrative.
Well, so much of Putin's way of framing events today goes back to the Second World War. It goes back to this idea that Russia will always have this Western enemy and that the West is constantly plotting. Now, I haven't heard Putin specifically reference the Lockhart plot, but the language that's used by Putin's regime when discussing the West, when discussing the idea of infiltrators, the idea of propagandists, the idea of manipulation of things in Russia, the idea that every act conceived of by the West is designed to destroy Russia in some way. You swap out the term revolution, because that's obviously not what Putin is doing now, but if you swap that out, replace it with Mother Russia, it's the same language that was being used 100 years ago.
And that, of course, is very convenient. So until his death in the 1970s, Lockhart's version of these events changed.
Lockhart maintains this idea that he wasn't really involved and had this peripheral understanding. He maintains that throughout his life when he writes his memoirs in the 1930s. That's the story. It starts to change a little bit in the 50s and 60s. He starts to distance himself even more from it, starts saying, well, actually, I never met any of the socialist revolutionaries, the people to whom he had previously admitted passing money. I never even knew Riley, that sort of thing. But then when you look at the letters he's sending to his son in particular, and this is old man Lockhart talking to his son, he is basically saying there's one letter in particular where he says the Russian version of events is basically the truth.
So do you have any indication that Lockhart knew what he was setting off with this Lenin plot?
I don't think so. I think looking at it through the lens of where he was in the summer of 1918, this was a chance for him to score a big victory. This was a chance for him to prove his doubters wrong. This was a chance for him to alter history. But beyond that, I don't think he foresaw the longer-term consequences.
And you spent about a decade working on this book. Why did you choose this very flawed man to spend so much time of your own life learning about?
Because flawed people are very interesting. If he was just some, dashing hero who did everything right, or conversely, if he was someone who just blundered his way through life, never got anything achieved, it wouldn't have taken 10 years, and it wouldn't have been worth 10 years. But the fact that he was this contradictory character, the fact that he is there from the very start of the antagonism between East and West, he sees it through the period of the truce, let's call it that, of the Second World War to fight Hitler. He sees that collapse. He's there when the real Cold War starts. The things this man saw, the life adventures he had, the time he lived. It's a fantastic story.
James, thank you so much for providing so much analysis on why we are where we are today through a very singular man. Thank you.
Thank you very much.